Hello, and a very warm welcome to our 15th Rare webinar and actually our first of 2025. I'm Nicola Miller, Editor-in-Chief and Creative Director here at RevRevolution, and I'm supported today by my colleague Becky Pender, who's working in the background on the tech. Today's session is looking at the complexities of genetic diagnosis of mitochondrial disorders, and this discussion has been supported by our friends at UCB, following on from our 2024 edition, which many of you hopefully will have seen, which focused on rare mitochondria. We've been thrilled to have so many of you join us today. It's been a great uptake, which is fantastic. And I would encourage you to use the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. At the very end, we'll try and get as many questions as we can through to our panelists. I've actually had the great honour of interviewing several of today's panelists, and all of them have been featured in previous editions. So it's really great to welcome them live today, as I'm joined by Dr. Amel Kara, Assistant Professor at Harvard Medical School and Director of the Mitochondrial Programme at Massachusetts General Hospital, Boston. Dr. Maria Hanlon, the Research Manager at the Lilly Foundation, who holds a PhD from Teesside University exploring the role of mitochondrial proteins in Parkinson's disease and is responsible for the end-to-end process of Lilly-funded research. And Philip Yesk, who has worn many hats in the field as a parent, a trustee, and now a Science and Alliance Officer at the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, and Paola Morandi, representative from the Italian patient group Mitocon, who is a patient expert and a board member of the International Mito Patients IMP. A big welcome and thank you all for joining us. It's really great to have you all in person today. I know I personally enjoyed meeting with you all separately for the previous edition, so it's great to have you here.
Hello, everyone.
Yep,
so,
thanks for the invitation.
Hi, thank you. So if you're a regular of our rare webinars, you know I always like to go back to basics. So what I'd like to do is kind of dive in and get a better understanding of the history of the mito landscape. Paul, I'm going to come to you first. What were the early challenges faced by the mito disease advocacy groups, sort of in looking back?
Okay. One of the earliest and most significant hurdles was lack of awareness, because mitochondrial diseases are a group of diseases caused by dysfunction in the mitochondria. However, for many years, these diseases were not understood even among medical professionals. Many patients with mitochondrial disorders were misdiagnosed or undiagnosed for years, as the symptoms could be vague and overlap with other conditions. This lack of recognition created so many problems with patients. They often had to fight just to get the proper attention from the medical community. There were limited resources and limited research in the beginning, so this was another challenge that was faced. It was another major challenge because there was scarcity in funding for mitochondrial diseases. Because these diseases are rare, there was limited scientific interest or investment, which led to fewer studies and a lack of targeted treatments. Advocacy groups had to push hard to raise awareness, not just in the public, but also within the scientific and medical community, to encourage more research, as well as potential therapy for these diseases. In the early days, there was also a shortage of specialists in this field, making it even harder for patients to find doctors who were equipped to find to develop their needs and to find answers to their questions. Stigma and misunderstanding was another issue. The complexity and rarity of mitochondrial diseases also create a stigma. Patients and families often faced a skepticism. Some of them were actually accused of imagining their symptoms or exaggerating, especially where symptoms were less visible. Advocacy groups had to combat the stigma, not just for patients, but also to educate the broader public about the reality of mitochondrial diseases and their impact on families. There are still cases where parents have been accused of exaggerating, and where children have been taken into care due to concerns. As the medical profession goes on, there are also visually impaired people with LH1 or ADOA who are accused of lying or exaggerating their symptoms. So there are also countries who have difficulty in believing that they're actually telling the truth. So this is causing a lot of issues, long criminal trials where they really shouldn't be. And hopefully, hopefully as we go along, these things will be solved.
Gosh, thank you, Paul. That's a really good snapshot of some very significant challenges there, and actually some quite horrifying ones there, particularly when you talk about lengthy court cases and those safeguarding issues. So really appreciate you sharing that. Maria, if I come to you, so that's a really good overview of what the experience for the patients and that perspective is, but how would you say the patient advocacy efforts have evolved over the last 2 decades, say, because there's been a big change, hasn't there?
Definitely, yeah. So patient advocacy efforts, especially in mitochondrial disease, has really undergone quite a remarkable transformation over the past 2 decades, with the help of organisations like those who are represented here today. Advocacy has moved from sort of relative obscurity to becoming quite a central force in shaping research, clinical care, and also public policy in the space. So, for example, here at the Lilly Foundation, we've always seen ourselves as the patient voice, and Liz Curtis, the founder of the charity and Lilly's mum, has always said that the Lilly Foundation was not just set up for Lilly, but in her memory to support and give a voice to the community who suffer from a disease that just completely turns people's lives upside down. And I think for us, the real first-hand experience that we had of patient advocacy was between around about 2012 and 2015, where we were quite heavily involved in a campaign to change the law to allow mitochondrial donation, which is a form of IVF that can stop the transmission of mito from mother to unborn baby. And we worked pretty tirelessly alongside policy advocates at the Wellcome Trust, scientists who pioneered this treatment, media outlets, and other charities as well, to not only educate but also to inform MPs and the general public about mitochondrial disease and its effects on individuals and families. And this groundbreaking technique, unfortunately, faced quite significant opposition in the beginning due to a lot of public misunderstanding and quite sensationalized media coverage, sort of including terms like Frankenstein science and that kind of term that was coined the 3-parent babies. But despite this challenge, we were able to leverage the power of personal storytelling with patients, and families and supporters were able to share their lived experiences with MPs, highlighting the pretty devastating impact of mitochondrial disease. And on the day of the parliamentary vote, many MPs actually cited these interactions as very transformative, ultimately leading to the unanimous passing of the bill. And this experience really underscored the critical importance of the patient voice in influencing public policy and really raising awareness about mitochondrial disease. And since those early efforts, patient advocacy has just become increasingly more recognised and valued. And today, patient groups are invited much more often to participate in conferences, events, and research discussions far more frequently than even sort of 2 decades ago. And this shift really reflects a much broader cultural and institutional acknowledgement of the essential role that patients and families actually play in driving that meaningful progress. And the role of patient and public involvement in research itself has also expanded pretty significantly in recent years, definitely in the last 2 decades. For us, this was launching the Impact Mitochondrial Patient Advocacy Committee, which empowers individuals affected by mitochondrial disease to shape research priorities, clinical care, and treatment development, providing a real platform for patients and caregivers to actually share their lived experiences and ensure that research aligns with the real world needs of the community, which is just absolutely incredible and has led to us being involved in the newly established virtual LAC-TREAT Mito Centre as well. And really, patient groups and patient advocacy groups are continuing to really influence the trajectory of mitochondrial disease research by really involving the patient community and, probably most importantly, ensuring that research actually addresses what matters most to those affected, through from diagnostic innovations all the way through to sort of therapeutic breakthroughs.
That's amazing. And it's really clear that actually in a relatively short space of time, advocacy groups have grown in hugely in significance. Paula, from your perspective, are there other kind of key milestones? And I know Maria mentioned a few there, but are there other milestones that you've seen from a patient advocacy point of view that you think have been important in that short history?
Well, true advocacy really began to take place in the late 20th century, I would say. The early recognition of mitochondrial diseases, actually, the first key milestones occurred in the 1960s, when scientists began to link mitochondrial dysfunction to a variety of neurological and systemic disorders. Mitochondrial diseases were still poorly understood, and their rarity made them difficult to diagnose. This lack of recognition meant that patients often went undiagnosed or misdiagnosed for many, many years. However, it was during the 1970s and 1980s that foundational discoveries about mitochondrial DNA, particularly the work of research, shed light on the genetic basics of these diseases. Formation of patient advocacy groups was very important also. The 1990s marked the pivotal moment in mitochondrial disease advocacy, as more patients were diagnosed and awareness groups, families, and individuals impacted by these diseases started to form support networks, just as was said. In 1995, the first mitochondrial disease patients advocacy group in the United States was founded, and becoming one of the first major advocacy groups focused specific on mitochondrial diseases, and providing information and resources to families, raising awareness, and fundraising for research. By this time, mitochondrial diseases were still relatively obscure to the general public, however. So the creation of such a foundation, was a crucial milestone. It provided a unified course for patients and their families, demanding recognition and research investment. Advocacy and research funding went on, and in the early 2000s, advocacy efforts began to directly impact research funding. The patients' organizations, lobbying for increased federal funding, particularly through the National Institute of Health, NIH, in the United States, and through the European Commission in Europe. Their efforts helped bring mitochondrial diseases into the spotlight. In 2011, the International Meet of Patients, I'm not sure if I can say that, International Meet of Patients was founded, and it grouped together all the major patients organizations around the world, founding the Mitochondrial Disease Week and LH1 Awareness Day, as well as the TK2D Awareness Day, and working on Genomate, which is a global registry for patients, mitochondrial disease patients.
Amazing, thank you. So lots and lots been happening, and some really important key milestones there. And Philip, coming to you, obviously you've had the privilege of watching this change, wearing different hats and in different roles throughout this. But thinking internationally, what role do you think kind of internationally operating organizations such as the UMDF have in advancing these mito disease advocacy as a whole picture?
Yeah, sure. I think, as I look back over the last couple of decades, and Paula and Maria have really eloquently kind of laid out the history of mitochondrial disease, particularly from a patient advocacy point of view. So many changes in just the way patient advocacy is perceived, as the role that it can play. I think initially probably somewhat constrained to the thought of being a support group, right? I know often the characterization was just buy some soft pillows, right, for the patients to lay their heads on, and that's what patient advocacy undoubtedly important, right? Sort of a compassionate component of what we do to ensure that the mitochondrial disease patients are well supported and have access to the resources they need, right, to manage their day-to-day life. But there's so much more. And, again, Maria touched on it from a research perspective. What really started as small seed grants, with relatively modest sums, over time, have grown now to be, truly impactful. I think importantly, any funding from a patient advocacy group from a research perspective principally is about trying to generate sufficient data for the researcher to take that project on to a whole nother level and likely get funding from some kind of government agency, right, to be able to do that. So there's a levering effect there that I think is really important in terms of patient advocacy group funded research. But with respect to international, Paula mentioned the creation of IMP around 2012. UMDF was one of the founding members of that, and I think it was a recognition that there's a shared mission, right? It doesn't matter where you're based in the world. We all want the same thing. We're trying to help these patients that ultimately don't have the therapeutics that they need, but also need access to resources. And so this is the opportunity that exists then by partnering through an organization like IMP is to find the opportunity to share resources, harmonize, amplified messages. And I know a lot of effort's been put into that. I believe now there's almost 20 separate organizations that are a member of IMP. And this will, I think, continue to grow over time. There's so much that we share in common, but at the same time, there are some differences and unique challenges. So, Maria mentioning mitochondrial donation or mitochondrial replacement therapy and how that's such a landmark within the UK and the huge effort by Lilly Foundation and many others to advance that to eventually clinical utility. In the United States, we face very different challenges, right? That approach has been somewhat locked inside our government process. And so from an advocacy point of view, we haven't had the opportunity, right, to get that into sort of the light of day, but we're doing the work behind the scene to ensure that we have our finger on the pulse of what the Congress of the United States look like, what the priorities are, what the opportunities may be to advance that. And so that's going to differ, right? And Australia had their own version of mitochondrial donation move forward as well. So, I think the takeaway is there's so much we can do in common. Another example being patient registries, right, where we have the opportunity to work together to help characterize these patients, particularly from the patient perspective. So UMDF stewards a project known as MitoShare, and we have over 35 countries represented in that patient registry, 2,000 plus participants. This is what it's going to take to reach a certain critical mass of data for both academic researchers as well as industry, the pharmaceutical biotech community, to be able to continue to develop the therapeutics that our patients so desperately need. So just a few examples of the importance of collaborating. I know we have funded research in collaboration with Lilly Foundation, Mito Foundation, Mitocon in Italy. There's strength in kind of working together and demonstrating that patient advocacy groups can do this in a strategic manner to try and advance the science in this field.
I love the word you used there, harmonize, because it's my overriding memory from working on this edition was I was so blown away by the collaboration that is happening across all stakeholders. Rarely do you see that in a disease area where there's so much coordination and so much goodwill to collaborate. So it was really refreshing to me. So I think that really stood out to me. So that's completely demonstrated by the way you're all talking here. So Amel, you come at this from a different perspective because obviously you wear that sort of clinical and research hat. How important has collaboration been between patient advocates and researchers in impacting the change that's happening?
It's been instrumental and very impactful. I personally benefited a lot from this collaboration. I can tell you I received a UMDF fellowship grant when I was still a fellow, and that has allowed me to do a fellowship in mitochondrial medicine and stay interested in the field and stay on and become a productive member of this community. And so fellowship grants very early during career development are very important and allow to engage more junior faculty and fellows into the field. Advocacy group, they all have their own conferences, symposia, and that is a instrumental conduit to bringing people together from all types of research fields and to get the discussion going so they can collaborate and improve research. Supporting grant funding, we've heard a lot about this. It's been instrumental because when it all started, there wasn't a lot of funding for mitochondrial research. Weren't it for advocacy group like UMDF and the Lilly Foundation and Mitocon, some researchers would never have gotten any funding to support their mitochondrial research. And that gave them the seed money to apply for larger grants and to do more substantial research. So that's very instrumental. Interaction, providing a platform to interact with patients and families. In some of these meetings, researchers meet with patients and families. So what they do in a lab is not obscure anymore. They can put faces to the research and it becomes very meaningful and it becomes personal to the researcher. So that's a very important piece. And we hear a lot every year when we do the UMDF conference, how impactful that has been for the researchers to be there in person and meet with the family and really understand their needs and why it is so important to find a therapy for mitochondrial diseases. Helping with education, as was said before, not just for physicians who don't know what mitochondrial diseases are, but also for patients and families so that they understand that research is important and clinical trials are important so that they can contribute and be part of these research, because a researcher cannot do research on their own if they don't have patient samples, if we cannot do clinical trials if patients are not interested. And that comes through education and patient and families understanding how important that is. We also have this new collaboration that was initiated by advocacy, putting together industry, like Phil said, industry partners with academic partners, with patients and family. All of that helped create this harmonized view of what the needs are and how can we meet them throughout all these stakeholders that have sometimes very different need and very different ideas of what needs to be done. We are fortunate enough to have advocacy group put us all together in one room to help us make decisions that are very informed and that help every stakeholder in the room. Supporting genetic diagnosis. A lot of advocacy groups have now been offering free of charge genetic testing, which has been the bottleneck to trying to find patients with mitochondrial disease. So by finding more patients, we are helping researchers and clinical researchers better study patients and have more patients to enroll in trials and to enroll in studies. And then legislative support. If it wasn't for advocacy going to the Congress and going to places where big decisions are made about where the research money should go, we would not have had money involved in mitochondrial medicine and mitochondrial research. So that has been very important, not only for the research, but sometimes also to allow for medical care to be reimbursed. And there are many procedures and many therapies that are not reimbursed unless advocacy supports that and fights for that. And then finally, some support for clinical networks. So we have support for our clinical care network where we have centers of mitochondrial medicine expertise where patients can go and get the care that they need. So advocacy has collaborated successfully and very positively with all the research and the stakeholder, whether basic scientists, translational scientists, or clinical researchers. And I'm hoping that with all the new ideas and the new interest from younger generation, we would be able to improve on that and find other ways to collaborate in the future.
It's amazing. And I think what's really impactful is how much can be achieved in a relatively short space of time when there is that harmony and that will to work together.